I'll just begin. I will begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I'd like to begin by suggesting that despite the recent turn toward terms like disruption, innovation in the technology and information spheres, we've been without a clear idea of what creativity is for some time. What I mean by this is that despite the enthusiasm for some way to think about change, particularly around the sorts of unprecedented novelties that technology is introducing into our lives, there's a certain tendency to think that all ideas relating to the new are exchangeable or roughly equivalent. Innovation, invention, novelty, the new, and creativity. First, I want to propose that all these words have a certain underlying tension between originality and creativity. In my view, what remains poorly understood is that originality and creativity are like two different generative processes that can't be reduced to each other. Secondly, we can better understand art and technology as a skill or know-how, a practical connection between knowing how something works and using this to generate actions. And finally, I want to consider whether this kind of skill, know-how, belongs to all living things. That is to say, I think we need to broaden our idea of what is artificial to see it as a primitive part of natural processes. It is not only art and technology that are artificial, but any way that living organisms bring changes into their environment. As such, it is not a question of being conscious of this or not, because this activity always played a significant part in altering the diversity and direction in which life develops. What I am suggesting is that having a better understanding of creativity and what role it performs might help us to better understand ourselves, other species, and how we relate to our shared environment. Creation and originality are like two opposing dynamic forces in a state of tension. The origin is the first, what everything has in common, while the creative is a particular that differentiates. The origin promises us a first, but we only really perceive a pattern. Things come into being. I plant a seed, it grows into a tree, it fruits and it dies. From this I know my seed came from a previous plant, and so on. Darwinian evolution and modern cosmology outline for us such complex patterns of emergence from an origin, just as creation stories of many cultures perform this function before them. That is, what we think constitutes the original source changes, but the pattern of originality remains. The origin is whatever is first, so it is what everything has in common. Now, we might think that creation is what causes the origin, but all we know for sure is that it is a kind of work that intelligent agents perform. Creativity is first an intention, a desire to create. What it wants to create is a difference in the world. A craftswoman cuts down a tree and she shapes it into a pedestal. A craftsman digs up a lump of clay and shapes it into a bowl. What here is creative is not then the intention to create, but making this intention real. It is the work that makes a change in the world. It is the chiselling of the wood and the suppleness of the hand that makes the difference. Therefore, the bowl and the pedestal are not in the origin, they are not in the earth already in the tree. If I planted a pedestal in the ground, it would not grow another pedestal. If I want another bowl or pedestal, if I want a new variety of apple, or if I want a new computer, I will need a creative agent to perform these actions for me, to work upon original materials. Creativity, then, is the work of a particular agent who aims to make things change or differentiate. Creativity is to work upon what is original. It is in this sense that creativity and what is original cannot be the same. However, this would not distinguish creativity from the modern idea of innovation, because this would agree that we are a special case. That is, innovation and disruption belong solely to the human world, and more specifically to the emergent technological world of industrial modern society. And if creativity as a concept is to endure, then it must be shown to have a much more significant relation to original nature. That is, we must ask how other living organisms, and species also perform this task of working upon their environment. From this perspective, I think we can evaluate to what extent creative activity collectively plays in dynamic processes and how it might impact original nature. Now, what I want to specifically argue is that this tension between originality and creativity is of the order of natural processes. That is, the tension between whatever brings something into the world and what determines how it will act and what it will do. Let me start with the more familiar context for creative practice with the work of art. If the work of art is not a picture, an art object, or something in an art gallery, it is rather because it's an older idea of art, which means it's something artificial, something that isn't natural, whatever it is that distinguishes human beings from all natural life. The Greeks called this idea of art techne, and what it means is technical skill, a practical knowledge or a know-how. It is to know how something works and to use this as the basis for a specific action that's intended to produce a particular outcome. Now, each human industry has its specific technical skills. An industrial engineer knows how turbulence works and uses this to shape the blades of a turbine. A farmer knows her crop sensitivity to temperature and moisture and irrigates accordingly. A lawyer knows how regulations might affect the outcome of litigation and launches rhetorical arguments. It is in this sense that all human disciplines remain art. However, this does not mean that creativity is the common denominator, the root of human endeavour, because what is common in all of us remains determined by our origins, whatever constitutes us as a common human species. Creativity is learned. It's a skillful work that introduces differences or deviates from original causes. That is why each discipline is not given and innate, but develops by innovations, each creative in their own way. It is also why each of us are different, why we are not defined solely by our original conditions, our genetic makeup, our race or ethnicity, and so on. We also come to be shaped by the choices that we make and the actions we perform. What is then comparable in the farmer, the lawyer and the engineer is that their specialist knowledge of how a system works is the source of their innovation. It is because they know how legislation operates or plants respond to climatic conditions that they can intervene upon these processes to influence and deviate them to different outcomes. Creativity is this kind of work made possible by technical skill, where knowledge is used to empower new kinds of actions. And it is in this way that creativity can be understood to be a particular kind of work each has to perform, despite disciplinary differences or besides philosophical, ethical, religious or scientific standpoints. I will add that this idea of art as technical skill might make clearer sense of fine and contemporary art if we understand that these are the disciplines that not only make use of this kind of work, but study creative practices as a kind of special focus. This does not mean that fine and contemporary arts are necessarily abstract or indifferent to pragmatic or applied outcomes, but rather that they study how creativity works in many different contexts. This is why so much interest in contemporary art happens outside of the gallery context, because artists are exploring their specialist creative know-how in non-traditional fields. It might be in scientific laboratories, or in natural environments, or on computer data sets. I raise this point because it might be a way to understand what art has to do with all the different specialist practices here at Futurelands2 and also at the Cementa Biennale, where there are many such examples of artists applying their creative methods upon the spheres of political activity, in the community or on the farm. If this propensity for technical skill defines us quite apart from the origin of our species, it is because it is this power to alter natural processes that made it possible for us to evolve from dwelling in caves to building houses, to transform grunts and cries into communicative language, and that marks a primitive separation from nature by accounting for all of our artificial, technological and constructive interventions upon the world. This is the work creativity makes possible. It is an action upon something that originally is in order to create from it something else. And if this sense of art as technical skill is of further use, it is because it is the root idea of the connection between art and technology as a kind of work, which is turned towards shaping or changing the natural world. We've become quite accustomed to thinking about technology in the context of its industrial, informational and global context, but technology still signifies the far more general idea of bearing tools, the chisel and the hammer, or the pen and paper. If this practical know-how is not given by our original nature, we might inquire whether this ability belongs exclusively to humans. I would like to spend the rest of my time in discussing how creative practice might be far more involved in natural processes. I will argue that human know-how is a special case of a simpler and more generic arrangement with a far longer evolutionary history. Now, I'm not suggesting that other living things can reason and think, which would be to say that they understand the consequences of their actions. If we're honest, most of the time, neither do we. I just want to argue that know-how is the practical capacity to sense one's environment and act accordingly. And this is broadly evident in living things. It's highly unlikely that a plant knows what the sun is, but it nevertheless not only senses sunlight, it acts continuously to change its form to maximise its exposure. So if know-how has a decisive impact in spite of a higher knowledge about this activity, it is because the action will be effective regardless. That is, despite to what extent other living organisms can anticipate what effect their actions will have, they will impact upon the ecological balance of an environment. It is in this sense that know-how, as a collective of sensitive actions, has an important role to play in natural processes. I'm going to look for evidence of this in the beginning of life on Earth and the emergence of one of the earliest and simplest life forms, the cyanobacteria. Now, cyanobacteria have a very special place in the evolutionary history of life on Earth. They seem to appear about 3.5 billion years ago, when the primordial Earth is hot, poisonous and volcanic, just out of settling period from which the solar system first emerged. Now, cyanobacteria are very simple life forms, but we know that they performed a function that was critical for the diversity of life. Cyanobacteria are firstly remarkable because they remained practically unchanged for a billion years. What this says is that the explosion of evolutionary differences in life forms did not come from our natural origins, the accretion of interstellar matter that constituted the Earth. Rather, what precipitated the many differences in species was the activity that these simple cell organisms performed, namely the function of photosynthesis, a process of combining energy from the sun with carbon dioxide to produce self-sustaining sugar and a critical effective byproduct, oxygen. The vast oxygen concentration on Earth is not a product of original processes. Earth's oxygen is the product of countless primitive life forms, their active output over billions of years. This extraordinary activity of photosynthetic production completely terraformed the Earth, radically changing the planet's atmosphere. It was this vast collective activity of oxygen production that generated the explosion of evolutionary differences of species that followed. That is, it was the activity of photosynthesis that created the vast diversity of life forms on Earth. Without them, Earth's original natural processes would not have themselves been sufficient. Now, I'm certainly not arguing that original geological conditions are not dominant in the evolutionary procession of life on Earth. But what I want to suggest is that while they certainly explain the conditions and the persistence of life, what they don't explain is its difference and diversity. This is uncontroversial insofar as evolutionary theory does not think that original natural processes produce the diversity of life either. What I'm rather suggesting is that creative activity, this collective active work that living beings perform, better explains this diversity than the alternative, the accidents of randomness or chance. And if there's an additional advantage to this idea, it is because such creative deviating work is only possible because it requires a modicum of know-how, a sense linked to activity, which means that all life must have a certain measure of autonomy and agency of its own. I'll conclude by saying that this sensitive activity, evident in all living beings, gives us an alternative way to think about the relationship that art and technology have to nature. That is, if our technical interventions upon nature are artificial, then so then are the interventions of cyanobacteria. The capacity to sense one's environment, together with the power to act upon this sense, must be part of natural processes long before the appearance of human minds, the wielding of tools, or the advent of machines. And if this work of creative deviation upon original nature that begins with the cyanobacteria has, for good and ill, been taken up with our deployment of skill from primitive art to modern technology. And it is this creative practice, the power to act and affect, that links the work of countless numbers of cyanobacteria to the billions of human beings now changing again the composition of the atmosphere through a vastly accelerated technique, our sophisticated creation of machines. Perhaps our climate crisis suggests there is a somewhat urgent imperative to understand how artificial creation operates in a tension with original nature. This is because the denial of climate change turns upon our ages-old inability to relate technology and human activity with nature. On the one hand, we often conceive that creative work is an impotent copy of natural original forces, which is why we sometimes suspect that our actions don't mean very much, or that art is a superfluous thing that can't really impact on important issues. And on the other hand, it is often why we think that technology is a desecration of the natural, that it's some sort of disastrous or purely corrupting power. To understand creation as the creative collective force of all the actions of the living, and whose task is to introduce particular differences, freedoms, and change into natural processes, might contribute to an urgent necessity to rethink these relations between ourselves and all other living species with which we share the world. Thank you very much for your attention.